Sha'Carri Richardson is a 21-year-old track star from Dallas, Texas. Richardson gained international attention after breaking the 100-meter record at the NCAA Championships by running 100 meters in 10.75 seconds. At the Miramar Invitational on April 10, 2021, Richardson would run a time of 10:72 in the 100-meter race, securing her spot as America's fastest woman and one of the 5 fastest women of all time. Richardson's mother passed away days before the U.S. Olympic trials. She would go on to participate in the U.S. Olympic trials, finishing the women's 100-meter semifinals with a 10:64 and the finals with a 10:86. She would now qualify to participate in the Tokyo 2020 Summer Olympic Games. She was expected to compete against Shelly Ann Fraser-Pryce for the gold medal. The celebrations would not last long, though, as Richardson would test positive for marijuana use. Her medals would be stripped from her, and she would receive a 30-day suspension, barring her from participating in most of the Olympics. Richardson would later go on to the Today Show and explain that her regretful decision to smoke marijuana was to cope with the trauma of losing her biological mother the week before the trials. This unfortunate event has raised some questions again about the legitimacy of prohibiting marijuana in sports. This moment of surprise, disappointment, and outrage provides us with a good opportunity to understand and discuss marijuana's place in sports and in larger society. Let's start off with the organization that was responsible for suspending Richardson, the United States Anti-Doping Agency, or USADA for short. According to the USADA website, the organization is charged with managing the anti-doping program in accordance with the World Anti-Doping Agency standards. We'll refer to them as the WADA for short. The USADA's responsibility is ultimately to prevent athletes from using performance-enhancing drugs in an effort to maintain the fairness and integrity of the competition. This organization is responsible for suspending Richardson, so who better to explain why marijuana remains an illegal substance than them, right? In fact, they specifically have a page devoted to explaining their stance on marijuana. Quote, "As some states have passed laws decriminalizing the use of marijuana, USADA has received more questions from both athletes and public about marijuana and anti-doping rules. Below you'll find detailed answers to some of the most commonly asked questions about marijuana, anti-doping rules, and health effects. For something to be added to the WADA prohibited list, it must meet 2 of 3 inclusion criteria. A. It poses a health risk to athletes. B. It has the potential to enhance performance. And C. It violates the spirit of sport." In 2011, the WADA published a paper in Sports Medicine discussing the reasons marijuana and cannabinoids meet the criteria. To sum it up, they find that marijuana fulfills all 3 criteria for various reasons that they claim are drawn from evidence. If cannabis appears to clear all 3 criteria for getting the ban hammer, then the evidence should hold up under scrutiny. Let's look further into the WADA paper and see if the points have merit. Potential to enhance performance. Let's start with the section on potential performance-enhancing properties, since it's the longest. Now, we could go through every study cited in this article and verify whether they support the claims made in the paper, but I think that would make for a very long and boring video. I went through all the studies myself, and I don't think I want to put anyone else through that too. Instead, I'll summarize the main problems with how they came to their conclusion in this section. And really, there are 3 main issues. The first issue is the WADA has a very vague criteria for determining what constitutes an unfair advantage. They describe that something is performance enhancing when it has the potential to enhance or enhances sports performance. This, however, does not mention if the enhancement must create an unfair advantage or not, nor does it mention what enhancing sport performance even entails. For example, if someone used a substance to cure insomnia so that they could participate in sports without being tired or depressed, would this be marked as an attempt to enhance sport performance? Would this benefit be considered an unfair advantage over other athletes? None of this seems to be explained in this section that is designed to explain why cannabis is performance enhancing. Without the need for the substance to create an unfair advantage, One could make the argument that water enhances sports performance because it keeps you cool and hydrated, or that coffee enhances sport performance in and out of competition because it gives people energy during training and competition. Therefore, they fulfill one of the criteria for getting banned. With such a vague criterion, pretty much anything that has a positive effect on your body could fulfill this criterion. As a result, their criteria for deciding what substances they prohibit are less objective than they present. The second problem with this section is that most of the articles don't even support what they're asserting. Many times they'll misuse the data to make an incriminating assumption that doesn't follow from what they're sourcing. This includes asserting that marijuana increases risk-taking and impulsivity, which is not supported by the studies they source, asserting evidence through unverifiable, unpublished hotline observations, ignoring conclusive data that cannabis decreases performance, citing the wrong articles, misrepresenting athletes' positions to make them look as if they're admitting to using cannabis to enhance sport performance. The list goes on and on. I'm not going to go in depth because ultimately it never matters anyway. Having such a vague criteria allows for people to assert that almost anything could enhance sport performance, either directly or indirectly. There would be no point in presenting their misinformation just to argue that it would be fair if their standard included fairness as a factor. I just thought it was necessary to point out that this paper goes out of its way numerous times to misrepresent data just to reach a conclusion, assuming that you wouldn't look into the data. But when you investigate further, you find that the sources support 25% of what the WADA stated, and they extrapolated the rest. This section is obviously not about if marijuana could be performance enhancing. We already know that marijuana helps with pain, anxiety, depression, insomnia, and relaxation, which could indirectly help an athlete perform better through not having problems like anxiety and depression. If this section was just there are performance enhancing properties of weed, it would have needed only one paragraph to prove that it fulfills the criterion, not 8. Obviously, marijuana has some qualities that could either indirectly or directly help an athlete. The real question this section is supposed to address would be if these advantages are unfair or not. Yet, in their conclusion about how marijuana fulfills this criterion, nowhere does it state that cannabis creates an unfair advantage, meaning they are not asserting that cannabis creates an unfair advantage over other athletes. Their only concern is that it helps the athlete at all, which makes you question, why would they go through all this evidence discussing whether marijuana gives an unfair advantage if all they needed to do was prove this obvious conclusion that it has benefits to those who use it? Well, they do this to give the appearance that their decision is based on an unfair advantage, so that most people don't question their decision, while they can tell more observant people that the only criterion it needs to fulfill is helping an athlete at all. Which leads to the third and final problem. This broad criterion is not applied consistently. We'll go over this more in a minute, but as a precursor, here are a list of medicines that are allowed to be used both in and out of competition. All of them have direct and indirect ergogenic effects involving antidepressant, anti-anxiety, and anti-insomnia properties. It's also common knowledge that all of these have potential side effects that constitute a health risk. Being that they fulfill both criteria for being prohibited, what is it that keeps these substances from being banned? It's almost as if they're making their decision by weighing the benefits and drawbacks of the substance's use, rather than just if the substance has benefits and drawbacks at all. What's my conclusion from the evidence they provided? Cannabis does not enhance performance in any way that non-prohibited drugs don't. And to the extent it enhances performance, cannabis does not create an unfair advantage over other athletes. Potential health risks. Rather than going through every line in this section to determine if the data holds up, I'm going to draw attention to a few significant parts worth pointing out, then explain their conclusion. The hard part of analyzing this section is that the WADA, just like the last section, gives a very vague explanation for how something fulfills the criteria of having potential health risks. If we take it literally, almost everything has a potential for health risks, especially when used in excess. Excessive caffeine, smoking, pill use, exercise, alcohol. Really, any excessive substance intake has the potential for health risks. If the criteria is only dependent on if any method or frequency of use can result in negative health outcomes, then the criteria would be nearly impossible to not fulfill. The more likely way most people judge a substance's health risks is by judging whether the risks outweigh the benefits. For example, antidepressant medication like Zoloft or Prozac, which are legal in competition, can cause irregular heartbeat, psychosis, and trouble breathing. However, it is judged to be legal because, and also in spite of, its ergogenic effect of controlling depression and PTSD. Now, aside from the fact that, by these standards, it would be both ergogenic and potentially harmful to health, it is still marked as useful enough to allow in and out of competition. As we go through this section, you'll find that the same standard of weighing benefits and drawbacks is not used here. First, there's the contradictory statements made throughout this section. They say that cannabis leads to poor decision-making after previously stating that it does not affect decision-making. They say cannabis leads to loss of vigilance after previously arguing that it increases concentration and sensory perception. Then there's the overall contradiction of arguing that cannabis impairs coordination, movement, and time estimation to the extent that it may cause more accidents and injuries, yet it's performance enhancing enough to give athletes an unfair advantage. Then they try to make the point that it could be dangerous to drive while high, which is weird to bring up considering no one advocates for driving while high. They mention spice, or synthetic marijuana, which is more dangerous than cannabis, but it's not cannabis. Like, it doesn't even contain cannabis, which makes me question why exactly it's even mentioned here. They really stretch to find enough risk to make cannabis seem dangerous, even reaching to potential health impacts of long-term smoking in general, linking cannabis to schizophrenia without having conclusive data on it being a causative factor, and even listing its withdrawal symptoms as the same symptoms they claim it solves. I think that's the worst thing they mention. Like, honestly, what a surprise that the withdrawal symptoms happen to be the exact problems this very study claims cannabis fixes. They could have just said when you stop using medicine, the illness comes back. The equivalent would be me stating that a withdrawal symptom of antidepressants is that the patient becomes depressed. Therefore, they should ban antidepressants. All this is mute though because this section isn't a question of how risky a substance is. It's simply if there is any risk at all. Since you can prove that anything has a health risk, this criterion could be fulfilled by any substance. Now, let me explain why I think this decision is misguided. First off, this standard is clearly not consistent. They claim that cannabis can be listed as a health risk, but allow other substances that can also be considered health risks, especially when used chronically or in large quantities. Antidepressants and pain medication have a string of effects that involve psychosis and trouble breathing and can lead to death in the worst cases. Alcohol or ethanol can cause kidney failure, loss of motor and cognitive function, psychosis, loss of consciousness, and death, in addition to being more addictive. Caffeine can cause heart attacks if used in large amounts or frequently. Nicotine, which is usually consumed by smoking tobacco cigarettes, is clearly ergogenic, highly addictive, more so than alcohol and weed, and has been proven to cause lung and throat damage, lung and throat cancer, shakes, heart disease, stroke, lung diseases, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, shortness of breath, and bronchitis, in addition to weakening your immune system. In fact, nicotine from cigarettes has almost all the risks that weed has, except more and worse. These are all substances that have been proven to have negative effects if used chronically or even passively and occasionally, most with ergogenic effects too. If there is actually a strict standard for determining if a substance poses a substantial health risk, then one must ask why the other drugs with worse health effects are allowed in and out of competition. This isn't even mentioning the seemingly contradictory sentiment of banning a drug for its potential negative side effects. In sports where people punch and knee each other in the head, tackle each other, ride vehicles at 120 miles per hour, flip people, kick people in the head, etc. I mean, it really doesn't make sense to argue that you worry about the minor health risks that come with excessive marijuana use, but you'll let someone play a sport where they regularly get concussions, brain damage, career-ending injuries to joints and bones, and death. But yeah, I'm sure smoking weed on your day off from getting elbowed in the face for a living is really the thing that's harming you. The second problem you should have with their decision is the blatant one-dimensional analysis in both sections. As stated before, one usually judges whether a substance's risks are sufficient for a ban by weighing it against its benefits, which is why antidepressants, among other potentially harmful substances, are not banned. The WADA claims to have a concern for the health of athletes, yet in this section about whether marijuana presents a health risk serious enough to prohibit it, the benefits of using marijuana are completely absent. One can only decide if something is worthy of keeping around if they look at both the costs and benefits. We determine that the benefits of having it available outweigh the cost that may come with its use. So being that we just went through an entire section where they discussed in depth marijuana's properties of relieving pain, anxiety, depression, insomnia, muscle spasm, releasing dopamine, causing euphoria, and bronchodilation, why are we completely ignoring this many clear and demonstrable positive reasons that cannabis is used when analyzing whether the risk makes it worthy of prohibition? Athletes already have an increased pressure to succeed, busy schedule, higher risk and number of injuries, which all work together to cause symptoms that athletes often use cannabis to recover from, such as insomnia, pain, fatigue, anxiety, and depression. If the WADA actually cares about the health and well-being of its athletes, they wouldn't prohibit players from using a substance which they claim has this many beneficial and therapeutic qualities over such minuscule and potential health risks. It very much becomes hard to give them the benefit of the doubt that they have the athlete's well-being in mind when they use relieving anxiety, depression, and insomnia as a justification for prohibiting a substance rather than for keeping it. While two criteria have already been fulfilled, putting cannabis on the list of prohibited substances, let's still take a look at how they claim it fulfills the last criterion. This section is very revealing to the motivations of the WADA. In this section, the hard part of analyzing their criterion is, for the third time, that it's extremely vague by design. To fulfill the third criterion, the substance must violate the spirit of sport. The first question one would ask is, what is the spirit of sport? They start off by admitting that they don't actually have a good idea of what the spirit of sport is. Of the three criteria to consider a substance or a method as prohibited in sport, the most difficult to define is probably the spirit of sport. Contrary to health risk and performance enhancement, the spirit of sport criterion does not rely on established scientific facts. Rather, it relies on ethical and societal considerations encompassing a wider view of sport beyond physical achievements and health. Therefore, the fundamental rationale for the aspect of this code does not include a strict definition of the spirit of sport, but instead provides a collection of essential values to be shared in sport. The values included are ethics, fair play and honesty, health, excellence in performance, character and education, fun and joy, teamwork, dedication and commitment, respect for rules and laws, respect for self and other participants, courage, community, and solidarity. In essence, it's a poorly defined list of subjective values, which is not surprising considering the last two sections. This seems more obviously intentional though. Giving a poorly defined criteria is a perfect way of making something fit outside your poorly defined concept. If I was to say, I have a spirit of gaming, which does not have a definition, but it goes by the rules of fairness, health, teamwork, and respectability. This allows me to say things like, I'm banning insert political party here from my group because I don't find their views respectable. Any criteria defined by a list of subjective values will inevitably be used by the deciders to exclude things or people they personally don't like. This is why the WADA's spirit of sport decision seems to be based purely on how they feel, as in if they like something or not. After going through the list of redundant and superfluous values they use to describe the spirit of sport, they finally explain their reasons for not liking cannabis. First, it violates the spirit of sport because in most of the world, it's illegal. The consumption of cannabis and other illegal drugs contradicts the fundamental aspects of the spirit of sport criterion. The international anti-doping community believes that the role models of athletes in modern society is intrinsically incompatible with use or abuse of cannabis. In other words, regardless of if you're doing it legally, they believe that it's incompatible with being a role model for athletes in modern society. Now, why would a legal activity that affects nobody but yourself make you a bad role model for society? They do not explain. Instead, they give the justification that it is illegal in most places. In other words, the morality of marijuana is being judged on the legality of it. This is a weak argument. Homosexuality was illegal in over half of the world up until a few decades ago. Are we really going to make the argument that because homosexual acts were illegal in most countries, we should have prohibited gay people from participating in the Olympics because they are bad role models for society? Obviously not. But what if kids see someone smoking weed, think it's alright, then light a blunt and get arrested in Russia? Well, let me ask you something. What if a gay person is in the Olympics and some teenager in Jamaica or Nigeria think it's okay to come out to their community, then he's imprisoned? Would that be a valid argument for keeping gay people out of the Olympics? Because some people make laws to prohibit behavior that they don't like in other countries? This is not a valid argument. In essence, it's just up to how a few people feel about if it's right or wrong to use marijuana. Regardless of if you're doing it legally or illegally, they feel like it's incompatible with being a role model for athletes in modern society, so much so that they were planning on banning it out of competition, meaning that if you wanted to legally smoke weed in the country that you live in months before a race, you would be punished for doing so, regardless of if it even provided a performance-enhancing benefit to you in competition, and regardless of if it was for therapeutic purposes. The only thing stopping them was that, quote, this appeared beyond the anti-doping mandate and it was believed to violate athletes' privacy. For these reasons, cannabis use is prohibited only in competition, not because it would be punishing you for illegal activity done outside competition and outside their property without affecting anyone else, but because they don't want to violate your privacy. In other words, because they can't enforce it without following all athletes around and rooting through their private lives like a totalitarian government. They state, use of illicit drugs that are harmful to health and that may have performance-enhancing properties is not consistent with the athlete as a role model for young people around the world. Now, we've already gone over their evidence for stating cannabis is performance-enhancing and harmful to health, which means I can hopefully say without controversy at this point that this argument is very flimsy and unreasonable. To supplement the unfounded notion that cannabis use makes an athlete a bad role model for young people, they used the following example. A recent case involving a high-profile athlete smoking cannabis out of competition triggered negative reactions by the public, sponsors, and the media, even if no anti-doping rule violation was committed. The National Sport Federation imposed a suspension on the athlete under its code of conduct, and sponsorship support was lost. They are justifying their statement that athletes who smoke weed are not good role models by pointing to an unreasonable outrage of the public and organization towards an athlete who was seen smoking marijuana. Put simply, They're appealing to public opinion. The incident they're referring to is when Michael Phelps lost a bunch of sponsorships because a British tabloid posted a picture of him smoking weed in a university. It would be redundant for me to explain again that stigma is not a justification for prohibiting a behavior. If their bad role model judgment is not based on law, because weed is legal, and not based on objective health concerns, because alcohol and cigarettes are allowed, then the only thing we can assume they're making this bad role model judgment on is a moral basis. Basically, because it has stigma connected to it, they make a moral judgment about it and use that moral judgment to ban the substance, which perpetuates the stigmatization of it. It's a circular process. People shouldn't use weed because people don't like when you use weed, and people don't like when you use weed because you shouldn't use weed, and you shouldn't use weed because people don't like when you use weed. Furthermore, it, again, draws into question the genuineness of the WADA's claim of caring about the health of athletes. Michael Phelps has admitted to using marijuana for specific purposes. Michael Phelps has already revealed that he has struggled both with ADHD and depression, having contemplated suicide after the 2012 Olympics. If the problem is that it was illegal, then the organization that banned him failed to support their athlete. Instead of encouraging him to go to a rehabilitation center to fix his addiction, or therapy to solve the underlying mental health problems leading to his drug abuse, they just ban him and his sponsors drop him, as if that's going to help someone struggling with drug abuse overcome his depression or addiction. Imagine if today, instead of putting students using opioids in rehabilitation, they just lock them in jail or ban them from a club they frequent and publicly shame them. Do you honestly think that would result in a positive outcome? To use this situation as an example of someone being a bad role model for society is to support the public shaming and banning of a multi-gold medal winning athlete philanthropist for using a substance that they admit has beneficial properties used to treat depression outside competition, with the justification being some people don't like cannabis. This is basically an argument for popular opinion, but this is not how we define what a role model is. That would be like if I explained someone being a bad role model with the example of a black woman breaking the law by refusing to give up her seat on the bus in 1940 because it was illegal and the majority of the community disagreed with her decision. In summary, they don't have evidence for marijuana being performance enhancing. They call it a harmful substance, which is a statement lacking perspective and qualification, and they call it illicit, which is dependent on where it's used and for what reason you're using it. In other words, they're being misleading and dishonest in order to ban marijuana based on stigma. Furthermore, they're ignoring the demonstrable fact that cannabis is becoming more accepted. In America, multiple polls and surveys have suggested that over 60% of the country believes recreational use of marijuana should be legal, which is the majority, and 30% believes that it should be legal for medical purposes only. When Michael Phelps was caught with marijuana, the number of people supporting legal recreational use was about 40%, but within the last 10 years, it has risen to over 60%. As much as the WADA wants to argue that marijuana users are bad role models, over half of the country already believes that people using marijuana are not inherently bad role models. In other words, the spirit of sport argument only works if you take into account the legal status of marijuana around the world. However, without pointing fingers, a good portion of the world is authoritarian or totalitarian, with governing systems that aren't even democratic, where propaganda is spread and media is regulated. Why would we use what portions of the world decide is legal or illegal to make a decision on moral values and fairness? Now that all that's explained, let's wrap up. When people complain about Sha'Carri Richardson being suspended and prohibited from participating in the Olympics over illegal recreational activity, most are not advocating for her to get special treatment because of her gender or her race or what she represents. People are angry that rules like this are still ruining these rare opportunities for athletes in addition to causing public shame and embarrassment over illegal recreational activity that's banned from sports, as we discussed, for the flimsiest of reasons, and in the broader discussion, based on blatant propaganda. Most of America has long been disillusioned by the sentiments that marijuana is harmful and makes people dangerous, while somehow also creating an unfair advantage. Most Americans scoff at the idea of cannabis users being poor role models. You can't prove that marijuana is performance enhancing, and data shows that it lowers performance. You can't show that marijuana creates a health concern that outweighs the benefits of using it, or even that it outweighs the benefits of other unbanned substances. You can't even support the statement that marijuana violates the spirit of sport, especially if you cannot prove the other two, and support for legalizing marijuana is higher than support against marijuana. The reason that marijuana is still prohibited from sports is because of stigma and propaganda, not because it creates an unfair advantage, not because it's illegal, not because it's a health concern. It's because of stigma. Because the men who make the decisions don't like it and will go out of their way to justify banning a substance that has nothing to do with sports or criminality or going crazy. So, what can we do? Well, if you're one of those people who genuinely think marijuana is one of the worst substances you can take and that it should be banned from sports, maybe rethink your position. Getting people like you to change your minds about this issue goes a long way for getting it both legalized and not prohibited from sports. As for the rest of you, I don't know. This video was hard enough to write. Go ask an activist or something. But before you do, if you'd be so kind, like the video, or dislike it if you still hate marijuana and anyone who uses it. Send it to your friend who's mad about Sha'Carri Richardson, or your friend who's still stuck in 2015, who's still angry at Mike Phelps. Okay, have a nice day.